in various regions of the country, maturity groups, the maturity groups that are successful are going to vary depending on where you are geographically. And it also depends, geographically on when they should be planting. But one of the things that we've seen here in the Mid-South area as we've gone to what we call an early soybean production system is that we've pushed our maturity groups, meaning that we're growing earlier and earlier soybeans and we're planting them earlier and earlier each year. Now, our yields have gone up substantially as we've adopted this early soybean production system. However, it's critical to match the correct maturity group with the correct planting date. In addition to matching the correct maturity group, it's also important to look at that particular variety's growth habit. For example, if you have a very tall versus a very short bushy variety, you may want to consider planting the bushy variety just a little bit later in order to gain adequate size so that you can have complete canopy closure. Or you may want to narrow your row spacing so that you make sure that you capture all of that light and don't leave a lot of that area open so that you get light hitting the ground and ultimately weed pressure and loss of moisture. We've got some interesting results from the last 3 years for this particular geography showing which maturity groups perform best planted at which particular date. For the last couple of years, we've looked at the effect of planting date on various maturity groups in soybeans. We've looked at those in both an irrigated environment and also in a non-irrigated environment. And what we've seen here in the Mid-South, at least in the last 5 or 6 years, is really a trend towards earlier planting of our soybeans. And we've also gone from the traditional Group 5 and 6s, and even some 7s to predominantly Group 4s and Group 5s. And as a result, we've seen overall better yields across most of the Mid-South because of this. The last several years we've seen really strong trends indicating that that is the correct direction that we need to move with our planting. Well, this year, unlike years that we've done previously, we were unable to get soybeans planted in March, which was our intention because of the very wet conditions we had. So the first planting date we had this year was April the 16th, which over the last couple of years has been our best planting date. Across 7 different maturity groups, those soybeans planted on the 16th of April actually averaged 77 bushels an acre irrigated. When we waited about a month, planted those same 7 maturity groups on the 20th of May, they only averaged 62 bushels an acre in an irrigated environment. But when we waited another month and planted those in the middle of June, those had the lowest yield of 43 bushels per acre. Again, these results are very consistent with what we've seen for the past couple of years and are also very consistent with data from across the region with various universities that have done similar types of work. When you look at non-irrigated soybeans, we saw a little bit of an abnormality this year. Traditionally, the earlier planted soybeans have taken advantage of early season rains in May and June and have historically been our best yielding soybeans. But this year, we had an extremely dry June and early part of July, and the bulk of our rain actually came at the end of July and 1st of August. Therefore, our earliest planted soybeans on April the 16th actually had the lowest yields of any of the 3 planting dates. The soybeans planted the 20th of May actually yielded 53 bushels per acre on average across 7 maturity groups compared to 28 bushels per acre planted the 16th of April. And then when we looked at those soybeans planted in the middle of June, those had an average yield across those 7 maturity groups of 46 bushels per acre. So what we saw is basically the timing of rainfall on dryland soybeans is critical to achieving good yields. Again, traditionally what we've seen is that the earlier planted soybeans take advantage of those early rains in June and early July. But again, this year, because of the way the rainfall fell, we saw better yields on our non-irrigated soybeans planted the middle of May and middle of June. A couple of other things that have been interesting over the last couple of years where we've looked at this study is typically the later maturity groups have yielded better planted earlier, and as we planted later into the growing season, we tend to see those early and mid group 4s tend to yield a little bit better planted a little bit later. And I think we can attribute this to the photoperiod response and how those plants actually grow off. We actually get better height on those soybeans as we plant them a little bit later, and we get better canopy closure. And again, it goes back to moisture conservation, greater light interception, etc. The group 5s tend to grow off a little better. They tend to get a little bit bigger stalk when we plant those earlier compared to, say, the early to mid group 4s. And again, those early to mid group 5s traditionally have yielded better planted in early April to the 1st of May.